So back to the topic of African borders and why they exist as they do. We cannot truly understand African borders as they are currently without understanding the scramble and partition of Africa, which occurred during the late 19th century towards the early 20th century. And this scramble and partition of Africa was majorly a time where different European countries sat on the table and decided which part of Africa they are going to take control over. So the scramble and partition of Africa was conducted during the Berlin Conference. And to give you a little backstory, before the Berlin Conference and before the Africa was divided amongst the different European powers, there were previous interactions between Africans and the Europeans, which was majorly through trade, whereby the Europeans came to the whereby the Europeans came to the African coast and essentially engaged in trade, whereby they obtained materials from the African continent and took it back to their continents, and sometimes they even obtained trade. So the more that the Europeans came into Africa, the more that they got interested into trying to understand this continent and trying to explore it further. So this also brought a lot of attention to Africa at the time, and more Europeans started coming to Africa, and as a result, this sparked interest in trying to explore the continent of Africa further. And this is when the Europeans now decided to set up the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which was organized by a man called Otto von Bismarck. So when Otto von Bismarck organized this conference, it was when Africa could be divided amongst the different colonial powers, and each of them will decide which part of Africa they are going to gain control over. So the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was attended by 14 countries, which was, and this entailed 13 European countries and America, the United States, of course. So during this conference, the main agenda was to discuss how they are going to gain control over the resources in Africa and to discuss how they are going to trade amongst themselves. The topic of the sovereignty of Africans or African people was not on the table at the time. And in fact, at the time, the Sultan of Zanzibar had attempted to join the conference, and he wanted to be invited to the conference. So he requested to join, and when he requested to join, Otto von Bismarck essentially ridiculed him, and other Europeans, they ridiculed the Sultan of Zanzibar for even attempting to join the conference, because according to them, Africans were not supposed to be there. And that is how it went down, because no African leader or president was in the Berlin Conference at the time. So the whites, the Europeans essentially laid the African map on the table, and each of them took up the parts that they wanted. And this is where the challenge now begins of African borders, and why it is still a troublesome issue even at the time that you're talking about it. When the African map was laid on the table, and when the Europeans took up all the colonies that each of them wanted, they did it, but they had very little consideration of the cultural and ethnicities of Africa. They had very little consideration of the geography of Africa or how the people lived. And in fact, most of these Europeans, they were mainly operating on the coastal regions of Africa. They had not really understood the African geography, the inland Africa, or how the geography was placed, how things existed, how cultures existed, the way of life at the time. So they essentially just drew up these borders blind. How do we put it? So they essentially drew up these borders with very little consideration or very little knowledge or information about how Africa was and how the cultures coexisted amongst each other, or even how the natural resources and geography were put in place. Because if you look at the map of Europe, the European continent, and even other continents across the world, you'll see that the maps are not clear lines. They are not straight lines that appear to have been clear-cut, as if they have been drawn by a ruler. The maps of, for instance, the map of Europe is not a straight line. And this is a representation of the shifting cultural alliances, a representation of the geography, and even a representation of the cultural interactions of the Europeans. But when you come to Africa, there are a lot of countries that whose boundaries and whose maps are literally just straight lines. For instance, let's start with Kenya. We have Kenya, we have South Africa, we have Botswana, we have Libya, we have Egypt, we have Sudan. All these countries, their boundaries are literally straight lines, and sometimes even these boundaries ended up cutting across natural resources and features such as mountains, rivers. That's why we have a case whereby there are rivers that are flowing through different countries. For instance, Lake Victoria is in Kenya and in Uganda. We have cases whereby there are still countries that are fighting over borders and over natural resources, even to date. And this is as a result of Europeans who drew these borders without any clue about how Africans existed, how the natural landscape had been structured at the time. Majorly because the maps that were created did not align with the natural boundaries that existed on the ground. So this issue of African borders is why even to this date there are still countries fighting over resources. Civil wars have been on the rise from time immemorial because of borders. We have countries like, for instance, there is Egypt and Sudan, which are still fighting over the Halabi Triangle. We have countries like Kenya and Uganda, which still have some feud over the Migingo Island. We have countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia, which are still fighting over borders because these borders were drawn by people who did not live in Africa, by people who did not experience the realities of being in Africa, by people who did not understand how the geographical features were located or situated in Africa. So you find a situation whereby we are living in regions which essentially were designed by other people who are foreigners, people who did not really live in these lands, people who did not really know how it was like to operate in these lands. And if you look back, most of our ancestors, because in this, even in the same light, you find a situation whereby, as I talked about, what I talked about in my previous video, you find a situation whereby there are different ethnicities in different countries. And most of these ethnicities, back then before colonization, they used to coexist. They used to move around a lot. They used to like share a lot of resources, a lot of natural resources. So when the borders came in place, the geographical borders came in place, it also ended up separating a lot of ethnic groups, such that you find there are, for instance, there are Maasais in Kenya, Maasais in Tanzania. The Anyi ethnic group are in Ghana and Ivory Coast. We have other ethnic groups, for instance, in Southern Africa, which exist in almost 6 countries. We have the Chewa people in Mozambique, in Malawi, in Zambia. Because when these borders were drawn, no one had consideration of how the people lived or how the communities coexisted. So even if you look at it right now, this is the reason why we have a lot of civil wars that are unending, because people were essentially separated. People were essentially separated. Countries are still fighting over natural resources because of this. And we keep asking ourselves, why are these civil wars not ending in Africa? It's one of the major reasons is because of the borders that were drawn. Because had the borders been drawn by Africa and people who really understood the geography of Africa and the African continent, I believe things would have been different. And someone will ask, why can't we shift the borders right now? Yeah, that's a valid question. If the borders are the reason as to why people are fighting, as to why there are civil wars, why can't they be shifted? And the main answer to that is that we cannot shift them right now because some of these borders have natural resources, and shifting them right now will mean more civil wars. Shifting them right now will require collaboration between different countries because these borders, most of the borders have been recognized by the United Nations. So if you talk about shifting the borders, it will mean having to bring on board different countries and different leaders, and all of those leaders have to agree that, for the borders to be shifted. And we all know that's quite impossible, because suppose if a border has natural resources and you want to take it from one country and put it to another, it's going to be a problem. So yeah, for you to understand, sometimes to understand these things, you have to go back in history, because right now a lot of Africans are suffering, a lot of wars are unending in Africa, but it's majorly because of the borders, because the borders are placed by people who had very little knowledge of the African continent. Yeah.